अब रेवेन्यू अकाउंट में यू हैव टू थिंग्स, एक तो आपका है रेवेन्यू रिसिप्ट्स, दूसरा आपका रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर. ओके, रिसिप्ट एंड एक्सपेंडिचर. ओके, नाउ इन द रिसिप्ट पार्ट, रेवेन्यू यानी डे टू डे आना चाहिए, शॉर्ट टर्म में पैसा कंटिन्यूसली आ रहा है. नाउ दिस इज द रिसिप्ट यानी व्हाट इज रिसीव्ड बाय द गवर्नमेंट. अब गवर्नमेंट रिसीव्स मनी from a lot of sources on a day-to-day basis. For example, government receives money from taxes. Now, taxes are to be paid daily, right? So, tax income or tax receipts are actually the revenue receipts. Tax receipts are actually the revenue receipts. Also, we have some non-tax receipts. Non-tax receipts. So, non-tax receipts, I'll be telling you what are the various things that come in the non-tax receipts. But these are some things that are not the tax per se, but these are non-tax receipts that are received by the government in the revenue account. So revenue account includes the tax receipts as well as the non-tax receipts, tax and the non-tax. And when you talk about the tax, that is the taxes that are going to be laid for the coming financial year and how much money will be taken from these revenue tax receipts. And in the taxes, you already know there are two big kinds of taxes. We call them the direct and the indirect taxes, right? So one left hand side, you have the direct taxes. On the right hand side, you have the indirect taxes. Direct and indirect taxes. Now, direct taxes are the kind of taxes in which we know, like we have the, say, for example, the corporate tax. Corporate tax is a direct tax. What is a direct tax? It is something, in which the impact and the incidence is on the same person. What do I mean by that? The impact and incidence is on the same person. Incidence is on the same person. Now, say for example, this is a person and government has levied the tax on him, and that means he has the incidence of tax. Now, when he has the incidence of tax and he is the guy who is paying the tax to the government, that paying would mean the impact. So incidence and impact is on the same person. But if incidence is on this person and he is actually transferring it to the consumers, and consumers are the one that are bearing the burden of the tax, that means impact of the tax is on the consumers. That would mean impact is on a different person, but incidence is on a different person. So when there is an incidence on a different person and impact on a different person, that would mean it is an indirect tax. Fine. So indirect tax has different incidence and impact on different individuals. Direct tax has incidence and impact on the same individual. Okay. Okay. Now you have the corporate tax. Corporate tax is kind of a first, most revenue generator for the central government. Corporate tax से government को सबसे ज़्यादा revenue आता है under the direct taxes. So direct taxes में सबसे ज़्यादा revenue comes from the corporate tax. Second is your income tax. Income tax number 2 पे आता है, जिसमें सबसे ज़्यादा revenue आता है. Then there are various kinds of taxes. तो corporate tax, income tax, security transaction tax, etc. So corporate tax is at the top because it gives maximum tax receipts to the government in the direct tax regime. Then number 2 is the income tax. Number 3 is the security transaction tax. So revenue keeps on falling from CT to STT. Then you have the indirect taxes. Indirect taxes are those taxes, say for example, in which the incidence and impact on the different individuals, like the GST. GST is an indirect tax. GST has to be paid by the shopkeeper, but the impact is actually bore by the customers. So GST, and like you have the customs duty and various kinds of other the indirect taxes. काफी सारे तो जीएसटी के अंदर है, काफी सारे जीएसटी से बाहर है. ना जीएसटी इज द टैक्स जो सबसे ज्यादा इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स रेवेन्यू देता है गवर्नमेंट को. So it is at the top, fine, at number 1. So number 1 it's GST that gives the maximum tax indirect tax receipts in the revenue account of the government. Okay. So whenever anyone tells you direct taxes come under, so they come under a revenue receipt, but under the tax bracket. Now, second is the non-tax. Non-tax is again a revenue receipt, but it is a non-tax. Fine. So it is again an income to the government. It is a receipt of the government, but it is not levied through a tax. So ये taxes के जरिए government नहीं कमाती. जो taxes से government कमाएगी, that is here. Fine. So this is the tax. इतना ही tax का जितना भी खेल है वो बस इतना ही है. So it is just a part of the revenue receipt. Taxes are just a part of the revenue receipt. It is not the entire revenue receipt. The major portion, a big major portion is also included in the non-tax revenue receipt. So non-tax revenue receipt में कौन सी ऐसी चीजें हैं that are very much जो गवर्नमेंट को काफी ज्यादा रेवेन्यू देती है. Say for example, in the non-tax revenue receipt, you have number one, profits and dividends from PSUs. You have profits and dividends from PSUs. तो पब्लिक सेक्टर अंडरटेकिंग्स जो आपकी गवर्नमेंट की है, वहां से जितना भी प्रॉफिट आता है, दैट इज पार्ट ऑफ द नॉन टैक्स रेवेन्यू रिसिप्ट. ये सवाल ऐसे ही आएगा आपको. फाइन. तो अगर कभी भी एग्जाम देना है, दिल आस्क यू दिस, व्हाट व्हिच ऑफ द फॉलोइंग डज नॉट कम अंडर द रेवेन्यू रिसिप्ट और नॉन टैक्स रेवेन्यू रिसिप्ट और समथिंग लाइक दैट. सो प्रॉफिट्स एंड डिविडेंड्स आर your at the top, are the non-tax revenue receipt, profits and dividends from PSUs. Then you have sale of goods and services. Sale of goods and services. Sale of goods and services under general services. Under general services. For example, power distribution. तो ये भी बेच रही है गवर्नमेंट, हर महीने इनको पैसा आता है on a day-to-day basis. Irrigation, banking, continuously पैसा आ रहा है बैंक से, insurance, etc. So all this money goes to the government. So that is considered as a sale of goods and services. Government continuously keeps on selling whatever they have to. So that is a non-tax revenue receipt. Then you have the interest. Interests received on all loans. Interests received on all loans. Interest received on all loans. तो गवर्नमेंट ने कोई लोन दिया है, उस लोन पे इंटरेस्ट आ रहा है गवर्नमेंट को. Now this interest तो कंटिन्यूअसली आता रहेगा, हर महीने आना है या हर एनुअली आना है. So whatever be the rate of interest, the money will keep on coming to the government, and that money, that interest money, not the principal. Principal is not part of the revenue receipt. Interest is part of the revenue receipt when the interest comes to you. Fine. So interest is coming to you, that is a part of revenue receipt. So interest received on loans, if these loans are given to, say for example, state governments, if these are given to anything, so जो भी आपने लोन दिया है, वहां से जो आपको इंटरेस्ट आता है, that is your non-tax revenue receipt. उसके बाद you have grants from abroad. You have grants from abroad. So government, if the government is receiving any grants from any of the countries abroad, that money would be considered as a non-tax revenue receipt. It is included in the budget. Don't consider the grants are because they are external and they would not be part of the budget. They are part of the budget and they are part of the revenue account, and under the revenue account, they are part of the non-tax revenue receipt. Okay, so grants from abroad are the non-tax revenue receipt. And then there is one more, and that is fiscal services. We call them fiscal services. Fiscal services. Now in these fiscal services, you have government earns a lot of income from medal minting. Medal the government देती रहती है, वहां से फिर उसको बेचा जाता है. Now it's not that much of an amount, but still medal minting, currency printing. Then you have the stamp printing. Then you have coin minting, etc. All these are your fiscal services, and the income whatever comes from these services are considered as your fiscal services, and that income is your non-tax revenue receipt. चलिए ये आपका क्लियर हो गया. नाउ कभी क्वेश्चन आ सकता है, से फॉर एग्जांपल इसमें आप बताइए कि सबसे पहले कौन आता है नॉन टैक्स रेवेन्यू रिसिप्ट में, सबसे टॉप पर कौन सा रिसिप्ट है, सबसे ज्यादा पैसा कहां से गवर्नमेंट रेज करती है. Now you have to remember that this particular thing, sale of goods and services, is at the top. Sale of goods and services is at the top. ये नंबर 1 पर आपको सबसे ज्यादा पैसा देता है. नंबर 2 पे गवर्नमेंट को सबसे ज्यादा पैसा प्रॉफिट्स एंड डिविडेंड्स फ्रॉम PSUs. नंबर 3 पे आपको इंटरेस्ट आता है, दिस इज योर इंटरेस्ट. नंबर 4 पे आपकी जनरल सर्विसेज. नंबर 5 पे आपका ग्रांट्स. नंबर 6 पे आपका ये फिस्कल सर्विसेज. Okay, so this is how it is the descending order, but you don't have to remember it. बिकॉज ये चेंज होता रहता है, अभी सोशो इकोनॉमिक कंडीशंस काफी चेंज हो चुकी है इंडिया की, सो दिस माइट disturb this particular descending order in the magnitude that how much the money is being received in the revenue account by the government. तो revenue account में revenue receipt वाला portion इतना ही है. There is nothing else that you have to study apart from what I have already told you. Now is the expenditure part. तो expenditure part को भी देख लेते हैं. So we are currently at the revenue account. We have covered the receipts. We now be covering the expenditure. The expenditure. Expenditure. अब expenditure में क्या क्या है? Now this is the revenue expenditure. This is some kind of an expenditure we call revenue expenditure. Is your बकवास kind of an expenditure, and it is totally consumptive kind of expenditure. इसमें कोई फायदा नहीं होगा, इसमें कोई capital creation नहीं होगी, इसमें capital formation नहीं होगी. There will be no asset building of the nation. कोई आपके पास asset नहीं आएगा इससे. This is a kind of an expenditure that the government wants to reduce. Fine. So this is a kind of expenditure, जैसे subsidies दे दी आपने. So that is a kind of an expenditure which is not good for the economy. Interest दे रहे हो आप. No, that is a revenue expenditure. Likewise, law and order पे खर्चा हो रहा है. Yeah, you have to give the salaries and you have to give the scholarships, and these are some of the things that government might have to do when welfare aspect is taken into consideration. But from a pure financial perspective, revenue expenditure is the expenditure that is a consumptive kind of expenditure. Consumptive kind of an expenditure, which is not yet considered good. Why? Because we want a developmental kind of an expenditure that would create some assets. But revenue expenditure is non-developmental kind of an expenditure. Non-developmental kind of an expenditure, or we can call it a non-plan expenditure as well. So it's kind of a non-plan expenditure. It's something that is not planned and that is consumptive, and that only gives money for the consumption and not creating any assets in the process. So that is all your revenue expenditure. So this kind of an expenditure is also known as the current kind of an expenditure. We call it a current kind of an expenditure. Current kind of an expenditure, and it do not involve the creation of productive assets. It does not create productive assets. It does not create productive assets. Okay. Now revenue expenditure. So revenue expenditure में कौन-कौन सी चीजें आती है? Revenue expenditure में the first kind of an expenditure in this is interest paid. Interest paid. Whenever you're paying an interest, and you're paying in interest to somebody that is that you have taken a loan from an external source, or someone from an internal source. So if you're paying an interest to external or internal source, whatever it may be, whenever you pay the interest, that is a revenue expenditure. Fine. So it's a consumptive kind of an expenditure. It will not create any developmental assets. Then you have the salaries, pensions, provident funds of government employees. This is again a consumptive kind of an expenditure, current kind of an expenditure. Salary वाली तो देनी है, उससे कोई asset creation नहीं होगा, उसको पैसे देने वो उड़ा देगा उसको. So that is a kind of a revenue expenditure. Then you have subsidies, and then you have defense expenditure. Now, mind you, in the defense expenditure, it is actually included in this only. Defense पे आपको खर्चा हो रहा है ना, you have to pay for their food, you have to pay for their clothing, you have to pay for their heating. अब आपने बिठा दिया इंडियन आर्मी को सियाचिन ग्लेशियर के पास, वहां -20 में तो उनकी बहुत अजाब होता है, बहुत बैंड बज जाती है ऐसी सर्दी में उनको. जैसे कि कुछ टाइम पहले भी एक वीडियो वो सरफेस्ड फ्रॉम लद्दाख, अपसाइड रीजन में एक mountain region say, they got the food, got delivered from an helicopter, and they took out some potatoes out of that, और potatoes में कोई भी छुरा घुस नहीं रहा था, because it was so hard potato, frozen temperature पे इतना hard हो चुका था. They got the hammer, फिर वो hammer से उसको तोड़ने लगे, है ना, फिर इसके टुकड़े करके फिर गर्म पानी में उसको उबाल रहे थे. दिस इज हाउ इन डिफिकल्ट कंडीशंस वहां पर आपको सब कुछ ख्याल रखना है उनका. सो डिफेंस एक्सपेंडिचर में दिस इज नॉट सम एसेट दैट यू आर क्रिएटिंग, दिस इज नॉट सम मशीन दैट यू आर क्रिएटिंग, दिस इज नॉट सम say for example some defense system that you're creating. No, it's a defense expenditure which is a consumptive kind of an expenditure. Okay, उसके बाद say for example expenditure on law and order. Law and order. So law and order पे whatever खर्चा जो गवर्नमेंट का होता है which is a non-developmental kind of a खर्चा, that is a expenditure on the revenue account. Then you have the social services like education. Social services में education में कुछ scholarship दे दी आपने, health में कुछ ऐसे ही जननी सुरक्षा योजना दे दिया and all those things. So education, health and all these social services जो भी इस पे खर्चा हो रहा है आपको, that is a kind of a revenue expenditure. Defense expenditure में suppose you have created a modern defense system. You have created a modern defense system. अब आपने एक मॉडर्न डिफेंस सिस्टम बना लिया. सपोज यू हैव क्रिएटेड एन एंटी बैलिस्टिक मिसाइल सिस्टम, लाइक इंडिया हैज ऑलरेडी क्रिएटेड द अश्विनी मिसाइल सिस्टम. तो इंडिया ने अश्विनी बनाया है, इंडिया ने प्रद्युम्ना बनाया है. व्हाट आर these are your anti ballistic missile systems that India has created. So India is one of those countries that have the system. Ashwini can be used to say for example intercept a ballistic missile till 80 kilometers and Pradyumna can intercept it till 150 kilometers. तो अब आपको समझ आ गया that you have these ballistic missiles which the other countries would want. So that is an asset that you have created. So defense expenditure में जो आपने इससे ये asset create किया है, this asset is not your revenue expenditure. I am talking about defense expenditure which जो consumptive kind का है. Salaries दे दी आपने, pension दे दिया, heating का खर्चा है, खाने पीने का खर्चा है. So all that amounts to crores and crores of rupees because India is one of those countries जिसके पास बहुत ज्यादा लोग हैं आर्मी में. Now do you know कि कितना है security forces इंडिया के? It is around 15 lakhs. Half, more than half of the security forces in India, more than half of the strength, that is close to 9 lakh, is concentrated only in one state. 9 लाख तो आपने एक ही स्टेट में डाल रखे हैं, तो बाकी के जो है वो पूरे इंडिया पर डाले हुए हैं. ओके, सो यू कैन अंडरस्टैंड कि कितना भी जरूरत पड़ेगा हमें पूरे इंडिया के लिए भी. एजुकेशन पे खर्चा फॉर एग्जाम्पल, नो दिस इज द काइंड ऑफ कंफ्यूजन जो बच्चे को हो जाता है. नाउ लेट मी गिव इट सम मोर टाइम. संदीप लिसन, जब भी आप एजुकेशन पे खर्चा कर रहे हो, नाउ एजुकेशन पे खर्चा अलग अलग किस्म का होता है. नाउ इफ आई हैव क्रिएटेड अ स्कूल, इफ आई हैव क्रिएटेड अ स्कूल, तो स्कूल इज एन एसेट फॉर मी. सो एजुकेशन में मैंने स्कूल क्रिएट किया, दैट इज नॉट द रेवेन्यू एक्सपेंडिचर. पर एजुकेशन में मैंने स्कॉलरशिप दे दी, इससे ऑन द फेस ऑफ इट प्राइमा फेसी कोई एसेट क्रिएट नहीं हो रहा है. Fine, and now you can actually say कि नहीं human capital create होगा and that will prove very beneficial and all those things. It might not prove beneficial because कितने सारे लोग, आप में से कितने लोग scholarship लेकर बैठे होंगे अभी तक. So that is not something that will guarantee you asset creation. So अगर आप school बना रहे हो, so that has a guaranteed asset, that is an asset for you. But you आप scholarship दे रहे हो, आप free में कुछ दवाइयाँ बेच रहे हो, so that is not something which will create an asset. It might be helpful for the welfare of the people, it might be helpful for the poorer population, but it will not create any asset in the economy because asset building is what we want. The gross domestic capital formation जो already मैंने पढ़ाया था आपको, वो हमने method of GDP calculation में पढ़ा था. All right, now जो भी आपका expenditure इस type का है जो consumptive का है, welfare scheme लेकर आ गए आप, and you gave 100 rupees per day to a particular individual, so that 100 rupees is a consumptive kind of expenditure, it's a revenue expenditure, it's not a capital creating expenditure. Okay, तो कोई भी आप बना लो, if you're not building an asset for the long term, that is not a capital expenditure, that is a revenue expenditure. Okay, the only thing that you have to see is that whether an asset is being created or not. If the asset is not being created, it will be a revenue expenditure. Okay, all right, तो ये भी हमने देख लिया. उसके बाद the last thing here, abhi we have seen interest paid, we have seen salaries, subsidies, defense expenditure, law and order, social services, and finally the grants given to states, इसमें countries भी आएगा and abroad, but generally उतना ये portion नहीं होता. This is a major portion here. Okay, so grants given to states. Now whenever you create give a grant, it will not create an asset now for the central government. Okay, so grants given to states and abroad is a consumptive kind of an expenditure for the central government, so that is a revenue expenditure. Now we have successfully completed the revenue account, and we have seen the receipts part, we have seen the expenditure part.